Okay, we left off our push notes on civil rights at this slide about the Little Rock Nine. Um, so we're going to pick it up right from there and start talking about the most central figure in the whole civil rights movement, of course, and that was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He emerged as this prominent national figure. He was a Baptist preacher, and a lot of his methods were based on some of Gandhi's methods that he used to try to obtain Indian independence from the British Empire in the 30s and 40s. So this included nonviolence, civil disobedience. So it wasn't passive resistance, as sometimes people call it. It was direct action, but it was nonviolent. That is the key. So the roots of the civil rights movement also had was rooted in a lot of the traditions of the African American church, the AME, because even in the 19th and early 20th century, a lot of the theology of that church was based on liberation theology. Google that as well. So he founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. So there's a bunch of acronyms that that you need to know for this class, of course. Whole giant alphabet soup of them. And for the civil rights movement here, we need to pay attention to about 4 of them. So the SCLC is one, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, in order to promote nonviolent direct action. That's key there, nonviolent direct action. That is doing things that break some local laws, but they wouldn't be things that are unconstitutional. So they were defying certain local laws that they believed were unjust in order to challenge segregation. So his organization was the SCLC. So let's move on to another aspect of the civil rights movement. So we're just going to like different highlights of it because this was all part of a big giant movement. And by the way, remember that the civil rights movement nationally is competing for attention, of course, with the larger conflict of the Cold War. And that's often why a lot of opponents of the civil rights movement also labeled civil rights activists as communists. And they were able to get some traction there because, of course, there's a lot of fear of communism at the time. This is the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis is about to begin here as well. And so there's definitely a lot of fear of that, and of course communism teaches this social equality. There is no value in any other social class, in any specific social classes. There's only the worker, right? So a lot of people equated civil rights activists with communists. So here we go. In 1960, these African American college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, began sitting in at a segregated lunch counter, and that was a Woolworth's store. It's kind of like a department store. And this then sparked the creation of another acronym, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So again, kind of easy to remember. It sounds like SNCC. So then nonviolent sit-ins actually sprang up all around the country, or all around the South, rather. And they were widely supported by the African American community. Oftentimes, these were accompanied by community-wide boycotts of businesses that wouldn't integrate. So this is a photograph that I took at the Smithsonian for American History in Washington, D.C. Pretty cool. If you have a chance to go to D.C., go to the Smithsonian's. It was a museum system that was founded based on the donation of an American in the 1830s, late 1820s, early 1830s, as kind of like a national museum for the United States. So there's all sorts of different museums there, but the best one is the American History. Check it out. So this is the Greensboro lunch counter, the Woolworth's lunch counter from Greensboro. They don't sit on it though. Boo. So some photographs from some of the various sit-ins and how some of them were treated and some of the experiences that they went through. And you can see it wasn't just black students that were participating in these student sit-ins, but white students. Some were from the areas, and others came in from other parts of the country. So what does the national leadership do during the civil rights movement? Because this is a Democratic presidency, or the Democratic candidate, or a cabinet, and it was the Democratic Party that was more affiliated with the civil rights movement than the Republican Party at that point. But neither party was really, I don't know, anti-civil rights. It was clear that that's where the momentum was going, actually. Even previously, President Eisenhower was kind of a moderate. He was the one that had appointed Earl Warren to the Supreme Court, actually. But the Democratic Party in the South, and they were the majority, of course, was still solidly segregationist. So the Kennedy administration, for example, and the Democratic Party nationally is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because they want to achieve some kind of civil rights change, but at the same time you don't want to lose the votes in Congress of Democratic senators and congressmen because you need that to pass other legislation. So you can't have the party splitting in two. So civil rights was a major election issue in 1960. Both Nixon and Kennedy supported some civil rights changes, and African American voters provided probably that margin of victory for President Kennedy. This was one of the closest elections in history. So Nixon lost, of course, and so you could say that the Kennedys were in the White House because of the African American vote. And the Attorney General, RFK, Robert Kennedy, was going to use the Justice Department here to force compliance with desegregation. We'll look at an example of that in a minute here. But he is, the top cop in the country. That is, he's the head of the Justice Department. So we've already talked about how the Supreme Court passed or ruled on Brown v. Board desegregating schools, and then another Supreme Court case to desegregate buses. That's a court decision. But how is that going to be enforced now at the state level and the local level? So city, municipalities, and states in the South, many of them still had segregationist laws. So who's going to enforce that? Well, it's kind of going to be his job. So the Kennedys, though, were very reluctant to use troops to force desegregation. It just doesn't look good nationally and then internationally. If you're trying to project to the whole world that America is like this shining example of democracy and equality, and communism is like totalitarianism, and there's no freedom of speech, no freedom of this or that, you don't want to be using like troops in the streets and in schools so that cameras can see all of that and so the whole world can see all of that. It would tarnish our image, right? So that's where the Kennedys are at. Let's move on to another aspect of the civil rights movement, and that's the Freedom Riders. So I just mentioned that a federal judge ordered all interstate bus terminals to be desegregated, interstate bus terminals. Why? Because the Supreme Court, the Constitution of the United States says that only Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce, and if a federal law or a federal decision says that they have to be desegregated, then it has to be abided by. But many terminals in the South were still segregated. So to prove and draw attention to the fact that despite this federal decision, many states still had segregated bus terminals, a group organized by CORE, another acronym you need to remember, the Congress of Racial Equality. They boarded 2 buses from Washington, D.C., and they were going to ride them down into the South, I think, to Jackson, Mississippi. So they wrote these interstate buses to verify that segregation was not happening. And of course, it was happening. So in Alabama, these Freedom Riders, that's where they met some of the first violence. So actually, I think it might have been like in South Carolina, but some of the more violent one was in Alabama. They were arrested by police, by state troopers and the National Guard. Some of them were severely beaten when they resisted arrest, or when they were beaten by like counter protesters, you could say, in the terminals. But that only inspired more Freedom Riders to come. So all summer, these Freedom Riders kept coming. So you should watch that American Experience documentary all about the Freedom Rider movement. And yeah, so a lot of them, again, it was interracial as well. These were not just Black Americans coming in from the North into the South. So these are some photographs of some of the violence that was perpetrated there. So one of the worst incidents happened in Anniston, right here in Anniston, Alabama, this was one of the first buses actually. It was firebombed. So it was attacked by, and this is the photograph. It was attacked by some of these, people resisting desegregation. Some of the passengers were beaten themselves. So this is all pretty shocking. I mean, this is happening. So I mean, federal government should be doing something about it, right? Despite what it does for the image. So in fact, eventually, Attorney General Robert Kennedy ordered federal marshals to accompany these the riders on these buses. RFK petitioned and confronted the ICC. As the Interstate Commerce Commission, if you remember, that was established, oh gosh, about 70 years before this period here, about its lack of enforcing the desegregation policy, because that was now federal policy in these interstate facilities. So he also sent 400 federal marshals to protect freedom riders. A federal marshal is kind of like a federal police officer, kind of. So the ICC made this announcement in September 1961 that they would all be desegregated, these interstate bus terminals, and so CORE achieved a major victory there. It came at a price, as so many of them, were beaten as well and hospitalized. But there you have it. That's nonviolent direct action. And eventually, the federal government did step in. Let's move on down to Mississippi. And the state university there, nicknamed Ole Miss. The governor of Mississippi was Ross Barnett, who refused to allow this man, James Meredith, to enroll at the University of Mississippi, and he did it, I think, like testing Brown v. Board now, because that decision was made in 1954. So here, this is I think in 1961. And Ross Barnett even made a radio appeal. Thousands of white demonstrators showed up and rioted, and 3 people were even killed. I mean, this is like a big deal, just because this guy wants to go to school. I mean, we think of the Boston bombings that happened last month, and 3 people were killed there, and they've got this international attention. Everybody was glued to the TV screens. Well, here, 3 people are killed in these protests just because this guy wants to go to school. So in September 1962, JFK actually sent in the U.S. Army to enforce a court order to enroll James Meredith in the University of Mississippi. So he was the first black man to attend that university, and here he's accompanied by U.S. Marshals as he goes to class. It's pretty crazy. He eventually, I think, went on to get a law degree. That, of course, sparked those protests in Oxford. That's where Ole Miss is at, is Oxford, Mississippi. And that Bob Dylan song that we listened to in class the other day. Later on, about 4 years later, James Meredith marched, decided to he called it this March Against Fear, to encourage other people to apply to admission to some of these schools and to register to vote. And he walked on foot from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi. And then on June 6, 1966, somebody drove by him because he was doing this, kind of like to raise awareness and sort of like a publicity thing. Somebody drove by and shot him. That's what you see in this photograph. He was not killed, but again, all he was doing was walking. He was not killed, and that only drew even more attention to his cause and his walk. James Meredith later on, he said that he was not really a fan of like the concept of civil rights or the civil rights movement. He said nothing could be more insulting to me than the concept of civil rights. It means perpetual second-class citizenship for me and my kind. So for him, it was like I don't know. He saw the civil rights movement maybe kind of like as special rights for a certain group, or I mean. For him, it was all about equality, I suppose. He was actually a lifelong Republican, and he worked for Congressman Jesse Helms later on as well. Let's turn our attention to Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, Alabama probably saw more violence in the civil rights movement than any other area of the South. And we're talking about the authorities in Birmingham, Alabama using violence. We're not talking about riots or something like that. And that's what you see here. That was a common tactic, using the fire hose. So Birmingham became like this epicenter, this major goal of the SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as they began demonstrating in 1963 in the spring to desegregate Birmingham. 1963 is going to be, well, all these years are pretty big years, but 63 is really huge for Birmingham and the SCLC, and a lot of violence. So the city of Birmingham had closed parks, playgrounds, swimming pools, golf courses in order to avoid desegregation. So in order to make sure that these people don't even have those grounds on which to, like physical grounds on which to protest, they shut them down. And this is when MLK was arrested and sent to jail. I don't know what the charge was. Probably like disturbing the peace or inciting protests or agitating whatever crowds. And that's where he wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail that just became such a popular and famous letter as kind of a manifesto of the civil rights movement. And Birmingham is also famous or infamous for its commissioner of public safety. He was kind of like in charge of all law enforcement in the city. His name was Bull Connor, and kind of an appropriate name. He actually encouraged some pretty aggressive police action in order to break up these protests and to arrest those that were protesting. So TV news was showing how the police was cracking down on these protesters, because Martin Luther King Jr. actually decided that for even like greater effect and publicity, a lot of the protesters were going to be children, and he was criticized by some people even within the civil rights movement for using children, because some in previous marches or previous other events turned into riots and some people were killed. So what if that happens to the kids? It's kind of dangerous. So they used a lot of children, and TV news showed these child marchers being arrested, and then some of the older students, teenagers, and adults. They used fire hoses against them, dogs. Some were clubbed, but this just continued. The protests continued, the boycotts, and it was getting a lot of bad press. Birmingham was. So people all around the country started like protesting the city or boycotting the city as well, until it was really pressured to change its policies. And this is one of the most famous photographs from the Birmingham protests and the police brutality, if you will, that ensued. This guy obviously looks very, I don't know, nonviolent, and the dog is just like ripping into him. These are teenagers just being blasted with fire hoses in order to break up the protests. So after his release, King began using black school children in these demonstrations, and Eugene Bull Connor arrested 1,200 children, as the rest of the country was like really shocked on it. So this public pressure mounted for civil rights legislation now at the national level, seeing like what this response was in the city of Birmingham. So local business leaders eventually gave in, and they agreed to desegregate the big department stores because of this public pressure nationally. Really shortly after this, Martin Luther King Jr.'s hotel room was actually bombed, and then rioting erupted in Birmingham as a result. He was not killed in that. So eventually, the Kennedy administration takes a stand. And they used troops to desegregate, sent in troops to desegregate, forced Governor Wallace of Alabama to desegregate the University of Alabama. Governor George Wallace of Alabama is famous for this quote that he made on the radio: segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. And it was around that same time that the leader of the NAACP I think it was in Alabama, he was murdered in his driveway. His name's Medgar Evers, and he's a must-know person that you need to know because jury after jury could not produce a conviction or a whatever it is, a verdict, and so the killer was never convicted. In response, JFK announced that he would send Congress a civil rights bill that would overturn segregation, would outlaw discrimination in elections, and give the Justice Department authority to enforce school integration. So it was some really tough language. Um, and it was in that same year, we're still in 1963. We've got Birmingham in this year. Medgar Evers is assassinated. And then this promise from the JFK administration to send a bill to Congress. And it's all in this climate that Martin Luther King Jr. calls for a massive March on Washington, which happens in 1963. Maybe 1 million people might have showed up there. We'll never really know. And this is looking from the Lincoln Memorial out on the Washington Mall. Behind that is the Capitol, right behind it. And appropriately given at the Lincoln Memorial, because of course it was Lincoln that was the great emancipator, Father Abraham, and this is where he gave the famous "I Have a Dream" speech that you should listen to online. You can see the highlights of it in like 9 minutes. Within a month, however, in Birmingham, more tragedy struck as someone bombed the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The only victims, sadly, were just 4 little girls in a Sunday school class. It was, a racially motivated act of terrorism, and it further drew Congress and the nation's attention and urgency to pass a civil rights bill, which is going to happen in the next year, 1964. But before we get there, let's talk about what happens in Mississippi in 1963 and 64. 1964, civil rights activists targeted this state because it was probably the most just oppressive segregationist system anywhere in the country. Targeted it for a freedom summer. 900 volunteers came to the state from outside of the state, a lot of them from the north, many of them were white as well, and it was, what formed was another organization called COFO. And this is kind of easy to remember because this is just a coalition of a lot of the other ones, of SNCC, CORE, the NAACP, and SCLC, and their whole main goal, the biggest goal, was to register blacks to vote. The vast majority of eligible black voters in Mississippi were not registered to vote. Some out of fear because, for example, 2 white activists and a local black activist were killed. They were pulled over by a sheriff, and the sheriff turned them over to some KKK-type organization. The activists were murdered. Their car was set on fire as well. And so there was definitely fear. Other reasons for not registering were probably a lot of restrictions that were placed as well. So tensions also developed between white and black volunteers who were, some of the black workers were, activists were much more, they thought that it should be a black-led organization or movement, and they also disagreed about the direction that they should take. Should they focus on nonviolent direct action or voter registration mainly? So that tension was always there. And with an overwhelming Democratic victory in the 1964 elections, the movement's leaders pushed for federal legislation to protect the right to vote. The Mississippi Freedom Summer did reveal one thing, and that was that there were a whole lot of really repressive and segregationist policies in voting, and then also within membership in the Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi. And that is going to be the context for the choices debate that you're going to do on Tuesday, as a whole group from COFO is going to want membership and delegation at the 1964 National Democratic Nominating Convention, where they were going to nominate Lyndon Johnson for presidency. So here's some photographs from the Freedom Summer movement. Help make Mississippi part of the USA Register to Vote. And this is a photograph of the activists' car that was set on fire. And these are the photographs of those activists that were killed. It was made into a famous movie as well, called Mississippi Burning, that you should check out sometime. And the fact that 2 of these people that were killed were white civil rights activists from the North is what sadly drew so much national attention to it. So the triumphs of the civil rights movement came at the constitutional and the legal national level in 1964. The 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes. That is, you don't have to pay to vote. Those were abolished. But the crowning achievement was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. So what this did is it forbade segregation in hotels, motels, restaurants, theaters, and sporting arenas that did business in interstate commerce. So if there's business in interstate commerce, then segregation is not allowed. It created the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So this is something that you might hear, I don't know, on commercials, or you'll see it on posters in certain places of employment, that they're an equal opportunity employer, and that they comply with the regulations of the EEOC. And this was created in order to enforce the aspects of the Civil Rights Act. It relieved individuals of the responsibility for bringing discrimination complaints to court themselves. Because, I mean, up to now, the onus was on these, like, black citizens from the South to do it themselves. And, of course, many of them didn't want to do that out of fear of attacks or reprisals against them. And so now the federal government is responsible for investigating that and bringing these complaints themselves. It eliminated remaining restrictions on black voting, and one aspect of it was Title VII. And this was discrimination. No discrimination would be allowed based on race, religion, gender, and national origin in the workplace. So this is national, and it's going to now be enforced by the Justice Department. All right, we only have one more major event, and then the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. and a number of activists targeted the town of Selma, Alabama, really the whole state of Alabama again, as a protest to reveal that most people who are eligible, most black people who are eligible to vote in Selma, Alabama, were not registered to vote. For example, 15,000 blacks were eligible, but only 383 were registered to vote in the town of Selma, Alabama. After 2 months of beatings, arrests, and one murder, civil rights leaders in Selma announced a climactic protest march. They were going to march from the town of Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 1965, and then that's where Martin Luther King was going to deliver a speech on the steps of the Alabama State Capitol. So it was going to be a big publicity event, and it turned, sadly, really violent. In response, on March 15th, President Johnson promised on TV to send a bill to Congress that would extend voting rights to African Americans in the Deep South, declaring, "We shall overcome," which was a line directly from some of those songs that were some of, like the fuel of this movement. So here's some photographs from the march from Selma to Montgomery. One area where this march became violent and ugly was on this bridge here. I don't remember what the name of the bridge was, but this is where I don't know how the violence broke out, but police were waiting on one side of the bridge and began to try to clear these protesters because they said that they would have been blocking the bridge, blocking traffic, and immediately started using violence to break up this march, and it turned really violent. A lot of photographs that brought a lot of negative publicity again to Alabama. But the march went on, and this is Martin Luther King delivering the speech from the steps of the Alabama State Capitol. So next year, another civil piece of legislation was passed that was really, as a result of the success of that Selma March, was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It made literacy tests unlawful. So first of all, a big difference between the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act was about desegregation. It was about desegregation in hotels, in the workplace, in places like that, and no discrimination based on gender, sex, religion, national origin, right? Desegregation. So Voting Rights Act of 1965 is, well, about the voting rights of American citizens. So this is mainly all about voting. So literacy tests are made unlawful. if less than 50% of all voting age citizens were registered. If so, African Americans could be enrolled whether or not they could read. If local registrars would not enroll African Americans, the president could send federal examiners who would register people to vote. So this gave some teeth to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The result was that 740,000 blacks were registered to vote within 3 years. Hundreds of blacks were elected by the late 1960s in the Deep South, not at the national level, but at the local level at least. Blacks no longer feared white reprisals, or at least not as much as before. And now, a whole lot of Southerners began to court the African American vote, that is, to try to win over African American votes. So the first time since Reconstructions, some African Americans migrated back into the South. All right, that's it for these notes. Thank you very much, and come back again.